to the death of my sister. My sister was 4 years old. I was six. And she was diagnosed with leukemia on August the 4th, and she died on August the 9th. And so ever since that date, my family has been looking for some meaning in our loss, and that led to the founding of the Coping Center and what is now um, a center that's located in Cambridge after starting in Milton and moving to Guelph for a while, with many groups every week. Providing support to people across all age groups. We have groups for kids, for parents who've lost kids. We've got groups for widows. We've got groups for people in the 20 to 40 age group range who maybe have never experienced any loss in their life and are surrounded by other people who haven't as well. So the whole family is covered from when they're little to when they're, let's say, older. I feel like that's a nicer way to say that. So today, I'm talking to you about something called anticipatory mourning. When Robin reached out for the Parkinson's Society, I realized that for many people's journey that we're going to be talking about now, we're going to be talking about something we call anticipatory mourning, and that is the loss of a lot of different things that are prior to somebody dying, but also I'm going to orient you to some of the things to think about when people die to support one another and to make our grief journeys easier. I'm not really sure exactly what the right terminology is for grief journeys. I don't know if easier is right or um, if there's a better word, but it's very complex to find language to wrap around these things. So that's kind of where we've landed over all these years. Let me start with just a couple of quick definitions and some understandings about things that maybe are not immediately evident in our cultural understanding of death. We have these sort of different things that we think about death, but have turned out to maybe not be totally entirely true. And so when we talk about somebody being bereaved, what we're talking about, like from a language standpoint, is to be torn apart and have special needs. The root words of bereaved sort of lend themselves to that definition. And so as we talk about bereavement and our journeys through it and in it, we sort of want to think about how we're torn apart and have some special needs. It's a nice way to kind of frame that up. First, I'm going to also, or I guess second, talk about some myths and some misconceptions that are around grief. We have these persistent sort of ideas about grief that live in our really Western understanding of death and loss. And so I'd like to kind of shake the trees on some of those. Before I do that, I do want to kind of tell you that many people kind of go, oh no, I've experienced this grief and I did something because of it. And are you telling me that I did something wrong? No. Grief is a journey that is really complicated and we do the best we can with what we have. And so if something sticks out to you as I'm kind of talking about these myths and the approaches that we take to grief and you go, oh no, that was not the best choice. That's okay. Lots of grace for yourself and other people in grief is really important because it's a very difficult and complicated thing. Myths are persistent because they often convey half-truths. They are false because the half-truth they express misses the other half or obscures it in some significant way, which leads to a false conclusion. So again, a misconception is simply a mistaken notion you might have about something you believe to be true but isn't. And so here's a few of them on grief that might stick out to you and often generate a couple of questions too. First of all, conceptually, our grief and mourning are the same experience. They're not. That is a myth. Grief is something you feel inside. It is essentially the awful pit in the stomach feeling, the painfulness, the sadness, depression, anger, all of those things, those are part of grief. Mourning is grief gone public. So what do I mean by that? Well, tears could be said to be a type of mourning because they are visible outside of yourself. Funerals are mourning. They're an opportunity that we get together with other people and we mourn publicly. It can also be activities like doing something in remembrance of somebody, perhaps even doing something like going for a walk. Usually, mourning needs to go with other people. That's really one of the ways you can kind of frame it. Both things are actually required to heal from a loss. Grief is going to happen regardless because you've lost a relationship, and that's what our emotional selves do when we need to say goodbye. Grief is also something we experience in other contexts. Lose a job, divorce, um, just significant change can sometimes cause grief. Moving, anything that really has change may have an element of grief to it. That will happen. But a lot of people fail to mourn. They think it's a private matter. They don't do things externally. We even rename some of our mourning things in a way that makes it hard to mourn. We call funerals celebrations of life these days. That's great, but we also need to mourn. We also need to be sad and we need to turn inwards. And so don't worry if you've called it a celebration of life. We have a little bit of a affinity for positivity in our culture. And that's what happens sometimes. But we do need the time to turn inwards and outwards and take some of that grief and do something with it. So a lot of the times what happens is people who grieve but don't mourn will find that they're living with some carried grief that sticks with them through life. And all of a sudden weird things start happening, like why am I way more irritable than I used to be? Why am I suffering depression? That was never part of my life. Um, oh, I've suffered this loss of a celebrity and I feel terrible, but I didn't even know them. That can sometimes be the echoes of mourning that just was never entered into as part of a grief experience. So, grief and mourning, definitely not the same experience. Both are needed for healing and loss. Myth number two, there is a predictable, orderly stage-like progression to the experience of mourning. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, 1969, published on Dying and Death. Fantastic start for things, hugely problematic now. Um, grief, grief is not orderly or stage-like. She identified some components of grief which many people experience, but not all. Some people don't experience anger as part of their grief. That's simple. Yet it is identified as a quote unquote stage. And certainly to consider them stage-like or predictable is definitely not the case. Many people experience sort of a bargaining or anger or anything out of order in those things, in those stages. And indeed, they're really not all encompassing. When she wrote that, she actually was intending it more for people who were walking through their own death. So for some of the people in Parkinson's sort of realm, it may present that way, but I suspect it does not most of the time. And I think sometimes you're in a place where you're accepting one day, and the next day you're back to being angry. And so I would say it's really important to kind of understand that, well, that was an important first shot at what grief looked like. It really lacked a lot of, I would say, nuance in terms of how it's actually experienced. And it's interesting to note that Kubler-Ross later kind of recanted on that in her later writings and saying, oh man, I wish I had not used the word stage because people really grabbed onto that. And so even she recognized the value of it in getting us started, but some challenges in the actual living out of it. You should avoid the painful parts of grieving by moving away from it. This typically presents to most people like if you just get busy, it'll get better. And that is not the way that grief works at all. Remember, I was talking about the ghosts of grief and the idea of carrying it with you. If we are not able to lean into those painful parts and turn towards them, it will typically result in some other undesirable consequences later on. There's a sort of a story we tell. I could never find the source of this. It appeared in some of our groups a few years ago, and I just thought it was really helpful in terms of understanding the way this works in mourning. It's a story about a man who had lost his wife, and he was having dreams, a recurring dream every night about how, and he knew it was attached to his grief and mourning. And so in the dream, he would see the sun setting in the distance and he would run towards it to try and stay in the light. And it would always set, and he was left feeling sort of alone and dark and very sad. And at one point in a sort of lucid moment in the dream, he realized that the sun was setting there, but if he turned around and ran through the darkness, he would arrive at the sunrise on the other side. And so that particular analogy or story, if you like, is helpful at describing what really has to be done in grief and mourning, that there is a part where you have to turn around and run through the darkness, maybe walk, maybe stumble, maybe sit for a minute before the sunrise kind of appears on the other side. Another myth is that we should get over our grief as soon as possible. This doesn't work. First of all, we don't get over grief. Our relationships are too important. They stick with us for the rest of our lives. And really what we're doing is converting our relationship with the person that died from one of presence to one of memory. It is still a relationship. It just looks really different as we make that transition into relationship of memory. Getting over our grief is just not reasonable. People say to me all the time, Adam, how long do grief journeys take? And I go, well, I don't know. They take about a lifetime. And they go, well, how long is it hard for? And I go, well, I don't know. It depends how much mourning that you do. If you're able to figure out effective ways to mourning, then yeah, your grief journey might feel a little bit less hard sooner. It's never about going back to normal. There is no going back to normal. There's only a new normal that you find. And, you know, the DSM sort of for psychiatry has something called prolonged grief syndrome in it now. I shouldn't be there, by the way. We shouldn't be pathologizing what is normal grief, which is what it does. And its suggestion is that if your grief takes longer than a year, that's too long. We think that's absurd. And actually wrong. It shouldn't be in there. I know it's in there so people can get insurance coverage and get a diagnosis to kind of be able to get more help. But it's an indicator really of how poorly we actually support one another in grief, that people after a year are in a place where they think they need medication to treat or get help with their grief. And that's not usually the case. Can be the case, but isn't usually the case. So we're not trying to get over our grief as soon as possible. We're in this for the long haul because we're in our relationships for the long haul. If you're mourning a loss of a parent, you've probably known them for 40 or 50 years. How absurd that that's a 3-day or a 2-week or a 3-month process. It's just not the way it works. Next myth, tears expressing grief are a sign of weakness. This is hugely problematic. The idea that being strong is somehow connected with the lack of tears causes a lot of people unnecessary emotional damage because they're just not willing or able to mourn. Tears, like I said, are a way of mourning things. And tears with other people typically also give other people permission to mourn in your presence. So certainly tears can be uncomfortable in our society, and this is kind of how it goes sometimes. But it's probably worthwhile trying to acknowledge the awkwardness of that and just saying this is love with nowhere to go. And that's what tears sort of show up. So that's the way that we would talk about the myths of that entering into that is important. Not everybody does cry as part of their grief journey. So, you know, if you're not a crier, that's okay. But I would say most people do. Last myth is that if you have faith, you shouldn't grieve. There's a persistent myth in many faiths that, you know, if they're in a better place. So I don't even think it needs to be a formal kind of faith belief. But if you sort of believe they're in a better place or in heaven or whatever the phraseology you use around that, that somehow that should relieve you from your loss. Again, one of the central needs of mourning is to convert your relationship with the person that died from one of presence to one of memory. That doesn't happen simply because you believe they're in a better place. That's not how that works. It may give you hope or make your grief journey easier, but it could also make it harder because a lot of the times you got to ask some questions about why them. Those questions are important, but I think it's, you know, in this context, just sort of saying that, hey, the myth that faith excuses you from grieving and mourning, it's just not there. So if you're getting that from, you know, faith groups or something, send them to see me. We'll have a chat. So there's a couple more things I kind of wanted to go over. I did talk there in fairly big detail about grief and mourning, but now I want to kind of frame up anticipatory grief a little bit. So let me just kind of review that again so that I can tie them all together for you and talk about anticipatory grief, which I think is really a significant component for those of you walking with someone with Parkinson's or experiencing it. So again, grief is anything you feel inside after you lose. Most people Most people describe the most acute type of grief they experience as death, but it can also be, as I mentioned, through other things like divorce, jobs, relocation, estrangement, even any kind of life transition. The feelings that come along with grief, I kind of didn't talk too much about this, but there's a few of them that are common, but not all the time. So there's no prescription in grief that you will feel anything. But the feelings can include things like numbness, shock, denial, confusion, disorientation, anger, guilt, relief, yearning, and sadness, often all at the same time, and sometimes changing over time and then revisiting them again later. Mourning, like I said, is grief gone public. So support groups, talking to friends, funerals, or other remembering activities and things like that are mourning. But now let's talk about anticipatory grief. So anticipatory grief could probably be framed up as an inner experience of expected loss, probably some of the same emotions I just mentioned for grief, and also a lot of questions of what if and what next, as you observe changes in someone who's dying or if you yourself are dying. Anticipatory grief can have a component of worry about it, what will happen once the loss occurs. That's a normal part of it for many. It also has some extra components of getting mixed in with life still happening. So sometimes has moments of peace, or even happiness and relief. Um, it is one of the biggest challenges in grief to hold two what are seemingly completely contrasting feelings at the same time and live in that. So there's some sort of weird liminal space that opens up that, on the one hand, there's some peace about somebody who is facing the end of their life, maybe even a sense of relief that their suffering is ending. But also, there's these moments of joy that are related to being able to spend a little more time together and continue to maintain relationship. Um, that liminal space is a really important part of a grief journey and anticipatory mourning, and just figuring out how to negotiate that. I wish I could say to you, this is the way you do that. That's not how grief works. Grief is a journey of discovery for yourself, and that also goes for anticipatory grief. But one of the things that's really helpful sometimes is to talk to one another about it and see where we're at. And that's why we run group support for grief at Coping. Another way you could say that anticipatory grief and mourning could be summarized is just to say they're really all about our responses to change. Even if it's something we're kind of looking forward to, that kind of makes a lot of people uncomfortable too. But the purpose of our conversation really focuses on things we aren't looking forward to for the most part. One more thing, anticipatory grief can have a dimension of ambiguity. You may, for example, be grieving a loved one with circumstances that don't have a clear ending. Addiction's a good example of this. Dementia is like this too, and so is Parkinson's. We don't always know what the end looks like in these situations, though we probably have some perspectives on it. All of those things come together to create sort of this cloud of anticipatory grief that we walk through as we prepare to mourn the loss of someone that we love. So a few more points. Like I said, anticipatory grief is often accompanied with many other changes. So, sometimes, as you all know, when somebody is undergoing a health crisis of sorts with Parkinson's, dementia, Alzheimer's, there's even late stage cancer treatment, it's very chaotic. And we don't like that. There are demands on our time that are instant. There's financial things that happen. There's all kinds of stuff that just makes it chaos, and that makes grief harder, quite frankly. It's usually got a sense of heightened emotions as people go through different transitions or changes. So things that would previously feel unimportant become very important, is one way you can phrase that. Uh, you have a tendency to imagine during the pardon me, let me rephrase that. Your tendency to imagine during difficult times may cause you to experience happiness or hopeful feelings about or after the loss, which then can cause feelings of guilt. So in other words, in the very tough slogging of end of life type of things, sometimes we go, I just want this to be over for them and for us, if we're honest. That is a very honest conversation, but a very difficult one to have with ourselves. It is often accompanied with feelings of guilt. That's okay. It's a lot of the times we make judgment calls about our emotions. It's a little bit of a danger in that. Um, our emotions are what they are. They happen because they happen. What you do maybe has a moral connection to it, I suppose. But I think acknowledging that sometimes these kinds of really hard things create, again, that sort of space where you have two feelings in conflict. On the one hand, you love them dearly and want them with you for as long as you can. On the other hand, the suffering is awful and it's hard to endure. And so, as I mentioned, there's liminal space or in between, which is both a privilege and a hardship as you companion those on their end of life journey. It is both of those things, as you guys well know. Um, so, what are some practical things that we can do as we start to kind of walk through anticipatory grief? This is certainly not exhaustive, but a lot of the times people say to us, look, I just need to do something. I don't know if it's going to help, but I want to try something and see if it makes it any easier. And here's a few things that we've sort of come up with over the years for both anticipatory grief and grief and mourning. Really, all of those things can be made easier through these approaches. One is to write down your thoughts and feelings in a notebook or a journal. Journaling is not for everybody. I personally, it's a waste of time for me. But for many people, it's very, very helpful. And so what I often say to people is they say, oh, I don't think that would be helpful to me. I often say, you know what? Grab something and just start writing. Just start writing about your feelings and see what happens because it's very surprising sometimes to people who are not writers or have an inclination that way that it's helpful to do so. So it's the all of these things are kind of like try them and see what happens. You can email or text someone about what you're thinking or feeling if you have supportive friendships like that. There's kind of three types of people in the world that we have when we run into grief, anticipatory grief or mourning. One third of people out there, they're not very helpful. They don't really listen. They have a lot of advice. They don't really kind of come alongside you in your grief or companion you with any kind of helpfulness. That's okay. Ask those people to cut your lawn. There's a third of people who are kind of neutral. They don't really help you or hurt you, but like they're kind of willing to be around. And so those are the people that you can kind of have a coffee with on a day you don't really want to do your grief. And that's fine too. And then there's another third of people who are really kind of really helpful and maybe could be framed as nutritious people. And they're people that pour into you as you walk your grief and mourning journeys. Find those people, hold them close. They're the people that will reach out to you instead of telling you, just call me if you need anything. Nobody does that, by the way. Uh, if you say, call me if you need anything, nobody will call you. So they're the people who will reach out from time to time, check how you're doing. Remember that this is a process that doesn't take 2 weeks, but instead takes 6 months, 2 years, 1 year, somewhere in there. I don't know. Before you sort of start to feel some semblance of a new normal. Find those people. Sing along with a song that expresses feelings. Participate in a support group. Lots of value there and lots of research that says grief mourning and anticipatory grief are best supported in support groups, far better than actually counseling or anything else. Certainly can be paired with counseling, especially if it's complicated, but support groups are seemingly the way that works. That's probably because they provide a forum for mourning. Make some art, making or doing something like baking, gardening, or some sort of sports thing. Actively engage in memories by making a memory box or a photo book. Little bit of a danger here with this one that you could end up torturing yourself, by constantly going through a photo book and it just takes you to a place that you don't really want to go. Um, there's no need to torture yourself, but there is a need to lean into the feeling and lean into the mourning. I don't exactly know where that is for each person, but there are people who really find that looking through the memory book, it's just not the time as part of in their grief journey, and that's fine. If it's torturous, doing it just because you see it on this list is not a good reason to do it. But for many people, that kind of thing is important. There's a young a child who came. Part of our children's program is creating a memory box in memory of the person that they lost. And this guy was about 6 when he came to our group about 30 years ago now. One of the very earliest participants in our coping groups. and when they were making the memory box for his sister. And his parents were telling us that when they moved him out of university, um, a few years ago, they found the memory box in amongst his stuff he had taken to university. He had kept it with him for 2 decades to remember his sister, and it was that important. So, making those memory boxes or photo books can be a real opportunity to revisit your grief and mourning as you go along in your journey. Um, See a counselor to talk, or like I said, a good, nutritious friend is very helpful in doing those moments of grieving and mourning that we need to do. The other thing I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about, hey, how do we actually come along aside each other as we grieve and mourn, and as we offer support to those around us. These are shamelessly listed directly from Alan Wolfelt's writing. He's the author that I've attributed this to at the bottom there. Write his name down. Every book he has written, all 120 of them on grief, are incredibly good. I have never come across anything that he's written where I went, Alan, what are you talking about? So he's an author you want to think of, and I'll give you a link to a useful book right at the end in a few minutes. Um, Pardon me. Companioning the bereaved is sort of our philosophy. It simply means to come alongside. It's not about leading. You can't lead people through their grief journey. You can only walk with them. This is true for anticipatory mourning as well. Companioning is about being still. It's not about frantic movement. Companioning is about discovering the gifts of sacred silence. It's not about filling every painful moment with talk. Companioning is about listening with the heart. It is not about analyzing with the head. Companioning is about bearing witness to the struggle of others. It's not about judging or directing the struggles. Companioning is about being present to another person's pain. It's not about taking away or relieving the pain, because you can't. Companioning is about going to the wilderness of the soul with another human being. It's not about thinking you are responsible for finding the way out, because you're not. Practically, people need to find their own way out of the wilderness, but being with them just makes that easier. When my sister died, my dad was still playing hockey, and one of his teammates in the senior A team in Cambridge came over to our house for 3 months, every other day. And they did not talk about grief, and they did not talk about mourning, because that's pretty tough to do when you're a hockey player. But he sat there every day and drank coffee and watched the game. And my dad said, as part of his journey, that was really a significant component of healing for him. Nothing was said, just coffee and a TV. So I tell that story just to kind of illustrate how that can really play out in real life. And yeah, there's an awkwardness to it sometimes, but that's space we got to live in. When words fail, use ceremony. So I do want to point out the importance of ceremony as one of the ways that we can grieve and mourn well. Ceremony helps us to acknowledge the reality of the death, remember the person who died, and provide a time of social support. It can help us search for life's meaning in our own continued existence. Similarly, for anticipatory mourning, it may be appropriate to have some ceremonies before somebody dies as a way to enter into some of that grief. Ceremonies are not rites of closure, but rather initiations. I'm sure you've heard in grief and mourning the idea of closure. I'd like to throw that word away and not use it anymore for grief and mourning. I suppose, you can use an identifier as a marker. So in other words, I suppose there's a type of closure that happens when somebody dies, I guess, but it's not helpful. So in other words, just because the word might be used that way doesn't mean that it actually does anything for people in grief journey. And the suggestion that in your grief journey something is finished typically is not actually true. While our grief kind of does ebb and flow a little bit, and some things are more important sometimes than others, I continue to mourn my sister 40 years after it happened. Sometimes when I look at my daughter, or sometimes when I have major life events, I still wonder what would it be like if she was here. She's been gone for 40 years, or more than that now. But I kind of think that it's important to sort of say, hey, ceremonies are a place you start. And they can often be the thing you do when you don't know what to do. So again, good ceremonies help us get started. Talk therapy is helpful, but sometimes what a traumatized mourner needs most is ceremony. There's no rules. And I've asked this question here, which maybe we can answer at the end, is can you give any examples of ceremonies you've been part of that have been helpful in a grief journey? So we'll see if we have any ideas on that in a few minutes. So, now we've talked about grief and mourning and tried to frame it up a couple of different ways. We've talked about anticipatory mourning. We've talked about some practical approaches. We've talked about the myths. What actually happens in our grief journey? What are our needs in our grief journey that we're trying to actually meet? This is 6. I'm not sure this is exhaustive either. This is also framed from Alan Wolfelt's writing. And these are the things that kind of happen in your grief journey. So the 6 needs: acknowledge the reality of your grief and the pending loss. That happens in your head first and then your heart. I'll give you a really interesting way this happens. Often when people die, we talk about them in the present tense after they die for a while. So we say things like they are, or she is, he is. And then all of a sudden, a few months later, you'll start saying things like they were. There's a verb tense that happens. And what's happened is your head has gotten to your heart and taught it that they're no longer with you. So first you start in your head with the idea that this has happened and we understand it cognitively, but it takes time to understand that in the core of our being and really, again, be leaning into that reality. Embrace both the pain and peace of your anticipatory grief. They are both legitimate emotions. Hold both in contention. They do not exist independently. Explore your memories of the person you're losing. So begin understanding what are the important memories that you have that are from when the times that things were good and things were not hard. Start to develop a new self-identity. This is a little bit undersold sometimes. We are often defined by the relationships that we have. If your parent is dying, you are their son or their daughter. What does it mean if you're not that anymore as they sort of slip away? They are your protector often. They are your safety in life. What does it mean if you are now in charge of your safety? Sometimes if that's a significant other, like a husband or wife, what does it mean to be a widow or a widower? How do I define what that is for me? So you can start developing a new self-identity. Perhaps if someone is sick, like with Parkinson's, you were not the caregiver before, but you are now. That's a new identity. All of these things are required as you mourn to figure out how or that newly defined identity fits with how you look at yourself. Search for meaning. This is really important and incredibly vague, which makes it very annoying, quite frankly. It's difficult sometimes to say, hey, what is the meaning in the loss? Sometimes people call this the reason that this is happening. I really don't like that word. People really want to live in an ordered world that has a reason for everything. That's not actually the world we live in. It's pretty chaotic, actually. So if we say instead of searching for a reason, what if we search for meaning? That seems to get us to a place that's a good thing in our grief and mourning. So for me, my search for meaning shows up in probably kind of what is a really identifiable and easy thing to say, hey, this work that I do in coping, that's a search for meaning. Meaning doesn't have to be kind of like really well defined or big like that, right? Like it can be very small. It can be something simple like, you know, relationships are really important. And now that I've lost this important one, I need to make sure that I look after the rest of them properly. It may teach you something like, I can't leave things unsaid because I don't know when the last time we can have a conversation is going to be. That's meaning. It's sad meaning in a sense, but it's still meaning, and it's important in our grief journeys to search for that. You don't usually know that you found it. You look in the rearview mirror and go, oh yeah, this is what this has done to me. It's not a thing that you can define. It's something you have to acknowledge or find or recognize after it happens. But the search is the important thing that creates healing. And lastly, reach out for support. We cannot do mourning alone. By definition, it is grief gone public. So one of the needs that people have is to make sure that they reach out for those support options. Just before we sort of start to finish up, I'm going to give you a little character here and a book that you can have a look at. So this character here means to listen. It's simplified Chinese, so but largely rooted in Mandarin. They pronounce it Ting. So if any of you know Mandarin, I probably just butchered that, but that's what this character is. And this is what we do with one another when we are trying to enter into grieving and mourning. there are components. There's the ear, of course, but there is you, eyes, undivided attention, and heart. So in Mandarin, if you listen to someone, that's what's made up of it. Do you know what's missing there? Talking. There's no talking. There's no mouth. There's the ear, the sense of sound, but then the rest of it is really important. And so as we endeavor to listen to people, listen with your heart, with your undivided attention, look to see what they're experiencing, and you participate in attention, and then hear what they say. This book here, that Wolfelt guy I was talking about, it's called Expected Loss, Coping with Anticipatory Grief. It's about 30 pages. Fantastic summary. I use this to specialize or make this presentation a little bit more specific to Parkinson's Society. Some of the things that I brought in here are from our general grief and mourning, but some of the comments I made on anticipatory grief you will notice or find in this book, along with a lot more useful information. So I would wholeheartedly recommend it to yourselves and those that you may run into who are walking an anticipatory grief journey. It's available on Amazon. I think it's about $9. So that QR code will take you to Amazon to order it, and I'll maybe leave it on the screen there. I was going to just cut to one of our logos for Steve to stop the recording, but I'll just leave it there in case anybody has a need for it, so that you can get your phone out and do that. Pardon me, do that QR code if you'd like to get to it right away. So that's sort of the conclusion of the things I wanted to bring to you today, and a few of the comments. And I'd certainly like to open the floor to any sort of questions and things like that, and maybe give Steve a minute to stop the recording.